being interconnected is not necessarily a good thing for other reasons. When things go bad in one country, they go bad in lots of countries. Most recently, we've had the U.S. financial crisis. Real estate prices hurt banking. Multinational corporations involved in banking were hurt, and so they had less money to spend in other countries, less money to lend in other countries. There was a slowing economy everywhere, which led to increased unemployment and decreased state revenues, which led to an increase in poverty. And you've got this vicious cycle that we talked about when we talked about the political economy stuff. In Europe, a number of major financial institutions failed and others needed rescuing. In Iceland, where the economy was very dependent on the finance sector, economic problems really hit them hard. The banking system virtually collapsed and the government had to borrow from the IMF and other neighbors to try and rescue the economy. Russia's key exports, oil, were a reason for the recent boom, but then falling prices had a huge impact on the budget, and investors withdrew from the country, probably trying to get, and then, well, they probably went back fairly quickly after the crisis eased as oil prices increased. Many Asian countries whose investors have put lots into the West have seen their stock markets suffer and their currency values go down as a result of America's crisis. Asian products and services are also global, and so a slowdown in any wealthy country, the US, but also Western Europe, Japan, anywhere, means increased chances of a slowdown in Asia and the risk of job losses and associated problems such as social unrest. Latin America is heavily dependent on trade with the US, so it's also been hurt by all this. Interestingly, African states, the ones least in on all the winnings of globalization, appear to be the least hurt by the failing global economy. Still, you've got high fuel costs, soaring commodity prices, together with fears of global recession, which can have a psychological impact on the markets. As well, you've also got less aid coming from the rich countries and rich institutions, like the IMF and World Bank. So interconnectedness can be a problem when things go bad. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about societal change, just to throw this out there and get you thinking a little bit about it. Today we've got this notion of cosmopolitanism, that there's this universal global political order where identities are a mishmash, they're drawn from all over. When you think about it, new identities in the form of social movements can spread from one country to another. They can adopt similar tactics, similar ideals that cross borders. So we talked about the transnational movement to end slavery. But when you look at it from another angle, think about American movies. Think about the Marlboro Man. It's hard not to find this in many other countries. The risk is that materialism and this, Western-based culture of consumption could eventually lead to this sort of Mick world, where you've got, you're really cheapening the most viable and prized aspects of cultures, and you're marketing these most viable and prized aspects of cultures, and everything else falls to the wayside. So cultures could literally lose much of what makes them into a culture. When you talk about ethnic groups, you could literally lose key parts of ethnic identity over time as a result of globalization. You've got the creation of new identities and the weakening of traditional social institutions, which can be particularly devastating in less developed countries. So think about how people exist in less developed countries. These are places where the state institutions are weak, for all the reasons we talked about in the last class. And so people rely on traditional social institutions in order to provide some sort of safety net. They focus on collectivism, on a strong family, which means that when I'm old and when my kids and my grandkids are going to take care of me, when I have a bad year and my crops don't grow, my kinship network will take care of me. Individualism, fostered by this Western culture, which is ingrained in globalization, means that I'm going to end up on the state's back. But if I've got a poor state, well, that state can't shoulder this. So you've got the weakening of national social institutions as well, flags, legends, symbols, anthems. Now, this could be great. People could shed some of these ideas of nation and nationalism, and we could have fewer wars as a result. But it could also undermine the state. Think about all this. If you don't have this connection to the state, you can lack an obligation, which means it's more easy to leave the state instead of paying your dues, taxes, for example. The gains also could be reversed. We could have feelings of unfairness, which can lead to resentment and protectionism. And in fact, we've seen that with each financial crisis, the Asian crisis in the end of the 1990s, the most recent crisis here and in Europe, what we see is a backlash as people try to hold on to traditional values. Think about right-wing parties in Europe. We just talked about that in the advanced democracy section. These are really people who are trying to hold on to traditional values, who are trying to protect their people from the outside. And globalization is all about bringing the outside in. From an economic perspective, there's lots of attempts to try to protect your own industries. This is popular. This is populism. So the last question then is globalization really inevitable? Well, given all these issues, and we've seen backlashes. So from the past decade, we can say, well, there are certain challenges. Terrorism can be used as a reason or as an excuse to restrict various aspects of globalization in the name of security. So restrict the flow of goods, restrict the flow of people. The financial crisis can be used as a reason to restrict the flow of goods and people as well. Technology and the technological know-how. We don't want these people to be going somewhere else, and so we'll provide them additional incentives to stay here. Interconnectedness can be dangerous, as we've seen from the financial crisis. So more reasons not to be connected to the world. Global opposition movements can be seen as a threat by states. Again, think about the role of technology, information. Protests at the World Trade Organization are a regular occurrence. So we could look at this at the international level, where the public is clearly angry about the evolution of some of these intergovernmental organizations and the way states have gone in terms of living up to these intergovernmental organizations, the policies they've had to adopt. Or we could look at the domestic process only, where you've got these global ideas of opposition that are brought down to the domestic level. In terms of regime change, which can be seen, again, as a threat to the incumbent status quo state leaders, and so they'll try to squash whatever aspects of globalization seem dangerous to them. And here, it's the movement of ideas, and so we've got censorship and things like that. In the European Union in particular, we could talk about over-integration or integration fatigue, where people become nationalistic, they become defensive over their national identity as a result of the various problems that they associate with globalization and the movement of other peoples into their lands, or other people's cultures or laws onto their own culture or set of laws, their domestic institutions. So all of these suggest that globalization, while a very strong trend, may not necessarily be inevitable, may not necessarily go in a single direction, at a single tempo, for forever and ever. So that's all we're going to talk about with respect to globalization. I probably will put up a discussion question on Blackboard, so be on the lookout for that if it comes up.